Ready? Okay, today's class is on ground leases. So before I start, why would ground leases be attractive to investors? Just off the top of your head.
So, from what I know, it's basically what's really attractive is that they're only purchasing the land, like for a land
They're not
grant.
purchasing the land, but they're getting control of the land.
Just getting control.
Ground lease are purchasing the land, no?
Now, there's still a fee owner that owns the land. They're getting the right to use the land for a long term or a low output.
Yeah, but then they're able to
They
also,
do have almost the same control as the owner. You're
yeah,
right there, yeah.
and then down the road they can own the building. Yeah.
Something.
If
it's
the
in-
tenant leaves,
yeah.
yeah.
It's very low.
But it also could go back to the fee owner too. Improvements.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start, but ground leases can be very attractive to investors because they can control a piece of land for much less than buying it, okay? So let's just go into what a ground lease is and what's the difference between a ground lease and a traditional lease. In a ground lease, a commercial developer leases a parcel of land and builds or allows his tenant to construct improvements on the leased property. They are usually long-term, and there's some ground leases that are on public property that you guys are probably familiar with, okay? It's become a primary tool of governments and quasi-government entities to generate income while preserving ownership of valuable aspects. Examples of this, cattle ranch. A cattle rancher leasing federal or state land for grazing, okay? They just lease it, but the government still owns that, okay? But it's a way that the government can generate income on a piece of land that they're not using, but they still can train ownership of it. Same thing with timber leases, federal, state, or private land, gold mining, mineral rights. At my Air Force base up in Northern California, we used to have tens of thousands of acres of runways, but then we had all this other land that was like near the road or just whatever that we leased out for farmers to farm the land. So it was just a way that, because it was land that was on government land, but you know, it wasn't useful, it wasn't near the runway, so we used to have guys out there growing strawberries and all kind of other stuff. Okay. All right, so developers like ground leases because they get the right to occupy and use the land with little upfront investment for the property owner. It generates income without investing capital to build improvements, and they still preserve ownership for future use. Okay? So for everyone gets something out of a ground lease. Okay? But you got to remember that with the ground lease, you have one more layer. So when you have a property that has a ground lease, it's more complicated than just from the owner to the developer, because there's something in the middle there, okay? So that's the main thing, but a ground lease is a long-term proposition, and we'll go into some of the links on some of the asset classes, but some of the differences, what would you say some of the similarities and some of the differences between a ground lease and a traditional lease?
Like the triple net, like responsibilities, stuff like that.
Well, those are if it's meant for triple net, but I mean, what's the same with a ground lease and a regular lease?
Ground lease, I think the developer developed that, right? And other lease with the building or whatever is in there, they have to maintain and everything.
Depending on how it's, but usually, okay.
Yeah.
Now, a regular lease has a term, okay, whether it's 6 months, 12 months, or 99 years. So that is something that's traditional. Also, monthly payments are paid to the owner of the property, usually monthly. That's the same as a regular lease. There's also all kind of clauses where you can evict the person if they don't pay. So there's a lot of things that are the same. let's go into some of the things that are different, and we'll go into some that are very similar. Same as a regular lease in that there are regular lease payments to the owner, usually monthly. Like a regular lease, the landowner has the ability to evict the ground lessee for non-payment. Unlike regular leases, ground leases almost always involve raw, unimproved land that the landlord does not intend to keep in their present condition, and it's also sometimes it's also a rehab or a tear down situation. That's usually where you get into a significant renovation,
Unimproved land.
or like a tear down or a big rehab type of thing.
Okay.
Usually it's structured around the tenant developing or construction improvements for their use. The tenant will own and use and depreciate the improvements, and at the end of the term of the ownership of the improvements return to the fee owner, or the ground lessee may be required to remove them. So normally those buildings go back to the owner unless the owner doesn't want them and is requiring that the ground lessee removes all of them and puts the ground in the same shape they found it. Okay, so those are some of the things that could be required. Typically, what set a ground lease apart is that it's long-term. In fact, in the old days, there were always 99 years. That was like old British common law thing. And the reason 99 years is become kind of commonplace is that anything over 99 years, they consider that ownership. Okay, so normally 99 years is the most you consider something to be a lease legally in the United States. Okay, now in many ways, the position of the ground lessee is the same as the property owner because it's so long and because they pretty much get all of the rights. In fact, there's only 2 or 3 things, like they can't lien or they can't sell the property or encumber it, but almost every other right that owner has, they have as the ground lessee. Okay. Now, even though 99 years is not the standard anymore, it must be long enough to amortize the cost of the improvements. I mean, you're not going to have a 5-year ground lease on a $50 million property that you don't have time to get your money back, to amortize it over it. And plus, there's almost always going to be financing involved in these deals. Okay, so modern leases are normally not 99 years. They are determined mainly by the value of the improvements and by what the lender requires. Okay? They want enough time to amortize the financing with some additional time in the event the lender needs to foreclose and sell the ground lease. Usually, a lender is going to usually require 5 to 10 years after the loan is repaid. Okay, that's how much ground lease time they want to do a loan on this deal. All right. So just some general numbers. Nothing is ever specific in commercial because it all goes by what you negotiate. But in general, most big box, which who knows what big box is? What's big box retail? What's
all the big
Best Buy? Yes, big, right? Okay. So for big box retail, ground leases are normally 40 years. And they usually have multiple options after that because if it's a great location, they don't want to have to move. So 40 years is normal for big box. Because think about how many multi-millions of dollars it is to build those, and you need that much time to be able to pay for it or to make it worth it a lender to lend to you on that. Okay, now fast food, QSR, like a McDonald's or a Pollo Loco. Who knows what the standard is for that?
10 years? 10 years?
20.
Not anymore.
So generally, it's another couple, 15-year options?
There might be 10 years standard as a corporate lease, but for a ground lease, 20 is what most lenders are going to want because they want years after it takes to pay it off.
Yeah. Okay.
But there are some 10, but
No, most of the one I see in the market for QSRs are Usually around 10.
Okay,
Usually.
okay. Let's say 10 to 20. Okay.
Usually, but.
All right. So a lender cannot sell the property like a regular foreclosure because they don't, they're lending to a ground lessee who doesn't own the property. They own the rights to the property. They own a long-term lease, but they don't own it actually, so they can't foreclose. What they can do is take over the ground lease. That's what they do when they foreclose. So what they do is they take over the lessee's leasehold estate of the land and improvements. The land still belongs to the fee owner. All right, so some of the other provisions that are in ground leases, some are standard in most other leases, and some of those are the use provision. So you can't get a retail area that's meant for retail and put like an adult bookstore on it. That's against the use provision. So it's going to have specifics on what you can put there. You can't do any major changes to the lease without the lender's approval. That's going to be in most ground leases. An estoppel, a requirement to cooperate on estoppels and certificates and SDNAs, lender approval on major changes to the improvements. All of that are parts of ground leases. Okay, so I gave you guys some handouts, and you will get those. They'll be in Dropbox, and this video will also be online about some of this. But there's a company called Safehold. Okay, and so I want you guys, if you're more interested in this, to go to is it Safehold or Safehold? Safehold. Okay, Safehold. Will's not around, so I kind of. Okay, Safehold. Okay. This is a REIT that is new to the business, but that's all they do is institutional size, big markets, big cities, but that's all they do is ground leases. And so they're on the stock market, and this is all they do. In fact, I heard about them from your Japanese clients who are into ground leases. So yeah, so this is an interesting company to read and learn about, and you'll see why a lot of big investors are going into ground leases, because the return is much higher, and the ability to lock up more properties for less capital is very attractive to investors. Okay, a lot of times the holder of the ground lease makes more money than the owner of the property or the person leasing. Okay, especially on a percentage of what they invest as far as what they get back. All right. Okay, so what happens? You should have gotten that from what I went over. What happens to the improvements at the end of the ground lease, or in case of default?
The ground owner owns the improvements.
Or what else could happen to them?
Extend the
Or need to
lease.
take them off.
They may have to take them. They may have to tear them all down,
Yeah.
depending on what the lease says. Yeah, but normally they want to keep the improvements. It makes property more valuable.
And just
But-
improve it, yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Greg, quick question. Can you talk about the way, like, you would price a ground lease? Like, how is it priced? Is it, because I assume it's a little lower than actually buying, right? The simple fee ownership,
Right,
right?
right.
So what's the valuation? And do you pay that like any other acquisition? You don't really, these are not monthly installments, right? You just pay that. Like an acquisition?
No,
Or-
you can finance it.
No, not financing, but how do you pay the landowner? You usually pay him like you would buy, like a regular
Yeah.
transaction?
Yes.
Okay, so you pay like at the end of escrow. I mean,
Mhm.
it's not that you pay them like throughout a long period of time.
Well, it's negotiable, but normally, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the lenders, we have lenders for that?
One thing too is that, I don't think Craig mentioned it, but you can't depreciate a ground lease. That's a huge thing too. There's
You can depreciate?
No, you can't.
Right.
You
Right.
can't depreciate a ground lease.
Right.
So,
But you can depreciate whatever you built on it. Like,
Right. You
You
can
can.
depreciate improvements.
Yeah, the improvement.
But that's for.
But that's usually
that's
not
what
the
you
ground
lease.
lessee though.
That's not
That's
ground.
usually the tenant, the person that's leasing,
Yeah.
that put the
Oh.
improvements on.
Or the lease.
So usually, because there's 3 people involved with this instead of 2. Usually there's an owner and the tenant. Here we have the ground owner, you have the owner of the ground lease, and then you have the tenant. So there's 3 layers. As far as price on ground leases, normally it's going to be a combination of what improvements are on there and what income they're generating and how long the lease is left.
Yeah, especially, I would say especially like Chick-fil-A. I see a lot of ground leases for Chick-fil-A, In-N-Out, and those are usually 3 cap.
Yeah.
Like 3 cap, just because it's such a safe investment here, you know. But you
So
know,
it's priced the same as if you were buying the property and the ground?
Only if it's Chick-fil-A.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
it's a good tenant.
But I think overall I think cap rates for ground leases
Like 6.
ideally are lower than regular triple net deals, but it all depends, the area, the demographics, the tenant, you know.
Usually
and all
cap
that.
rate's higher, isn't it?
No, it's actually lower for ground leases usually.
Have lenders for this?
Yes.
So you get less
Wait, you
return.
mean lower, that you get more,
If you're the-
you pay more money for them?
Yeah.
I'm saying for ground leases,
Mm-hmm.
most of the time, like, it shows that the return's actually lower because it's not as much risk involved,
No, but the price.
right? Yeah, well, the
The
return,
acquisition price is actually lower?
no, acquisition's higher if the cap is lower.
So is it? That's
Yeah.
the case?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
I thought it was the other way around.
So you give up the IRR.
Well,
on the
it
cap
depends the
rate.
area.
It depends on the area. It's
Depends on the
all, yeah, it all depends.
And the, I would say the biggest, fast food is big on ground leases, so is gas stations, and big box retail. A lot of ground leases for that. And of course, ground leases are huge with, all kind of, oil drilling. Most of those companies that do gold mining, oil drilling, cattle, none of them usually own that land. It's usually it could be either from a private owner of land, or it could be from the government or from the state or federal government. So,
Those strawberry fields in Oxnard, are they all ground leased, you think? All the strawberry fields in Oxnard?
they could be, but they could just be the family that originally owned them.
McGrath, yeah.
Yeah.
Probably.
So anyway, so this is like, something that you might come across. So, read more of the details in this. We can't go over everything in a 30-minute class, but basically I just wanted to give you guys an overview so you kind of knew what was going on. And there will be differences in value and in cap rate when a ground lease is involved. And it does make it just not a lot more complicated, but a little bit more involved, okay? So when you see like a weird price, weird cap rate around everything else, that might be one thing to look at if there's a ground lease involved.
I have a question. You were talking about Ventura County for a minute, and I noticed there's a lot of construction going on up there in the last few years. A lot of hotels, industrial buildings, and business park centers. Is that because you think the ground leases, like these 99-year leases, are up, and the land value is so high that they're selling and developing now?
That's a big,
Maybe
that could
part
be
of
it,
it.
because that's why the owners don't just sell their property, because they want to be able to, they want to be able to have steady income, but they still want the option when the ground lease is up to be able to,
Oh, okay.
sell that property at the top of a market that, that might have been middle of nowhere a long time ago. They've had a 50-year ground lease, now it's up, and now it's in the middle of everything, and it's worth,
Okay, so not
yeah.
sell it outright, but still
Right.
do this process and have a percentage, like if a hotel is gonna be built on it, a percentage.
It's like a covered land play.
That's nice.
They have the land and they're covering their expenses, and
Nice.
then later they can make a big play on it to redevelop it or to sell it to somebody when it's worth way more.
Okay.
So with that said, I think in that market, there's always been a bit of a demand for hospitality related properties. So that's why I think we're seeing this kind of uptick in construction for them.
Yeah,
But,
There's a lot in Ventura, you're right.
yeah, a lot of agriculture
Oh.
there, but.
No, also multifamily. units.
Yeah, I think we're seeing density
Everywhere.
increase.
Yeah.
God,
Ventura
everywhere.
County's going nuts with
Yeah.
construction.
Yeah,
Exactly.
because they're one of the few places that's near here that has
There's a lot of
open land,
land.
and you don't wanna have to go to Palmdale or, Riverside, so yeah. It's more attractive to go out there.
Going, the direction
Okay.
of growth is going up north.
True. Okay, any other questions?
No, we're ready.
Okay, thanks guys, appreciate it.
Thank you.